I just had a quick question.
Sure.
I'm in both this class and then the 1261 right after.
Yes.
And on my calendar, I had written that there's a test for both of those classes on the 23rd. I don't think that's right. I think I mixed that up.
There's a take-home
And I was
test.
just wondering.
So on the 23rd, I'm going to post a take-home test, and it's due 1 week. It's due on the 30th. So on the 23rd, I'll post the test online, and you have until the 30th to finish it. It's just a series of short answers from, and that's in the 1261 class. So the
1261.
1261 class
Okay.
with the Robert Brim book, you'll be asked to
Okay.
define 4 concepts from the textbook in short answers. So
Okay.
something like Marxism, you'll be asked to define Marxism or conflict theory, and you can cite from the textbook and write 1 short paragraph to answer each concept or to define each
Okay,
concept.
perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, I
Only
knew that part.
4
I
are
wasn't sure which class. Oh, pardon me?
for this one, for the 2307, there's a take-home test as well, and it's not until next week. So it's the 30th.
Okay, yeah, I had just written both of them down on the 23rd, and then I'd mixed up the one on the 30th. I was like, no, one of these is one day, one of these is the other day. So, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
That makes so much more sense. Thank you so much.
No problem. Yeah, I'll post the guidelines as well for the presentation and the final assignment this week. So the presentation assignment is due in March, and then the final assignment is due in April. So for this class, then there is a presentation, a final assignment, and then the take-home test. For the 1261 class, there are just tests. So there are 4 tests.
Okay. Yeah, and I have both of the guidelines pulled up, but I just get confused on which one is which because I knew one of them was all test-based, and then one of them there was a project with other tests. So, okay.
Yeah, the one that's
Perfect.
1261, because it's a first year, there's just tests. This one is more
Okay.
advanced, so there's an essay.
Okay, that makes more sense. Perfect. Oh, I was so confused about that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'll wait a few more minutes to start. In terms of the attendance, I'm not going to be too strict. Like you are asked to, like, you are given 10% for attendance, but it's difficult to really know who is attending and how much you're participating because it's online. So I'm going to ask you to give yourself a mark out of 10 at the end for attendance. So if you cannot attend during this hour, you're welcome to watch the recorded lectures online. And obviously it's up to you. Like if you want to attend during this hour, you can, and then we can have a discussion now. And it's probably to your, I think it's beneficial for you to attend now during this hour, because if you have any questions about the assignments or the readings, then you can ask me. If you cannot attend, then you can watch the recorded lectures, but then you can't really ask any questions. So if there's anything that's unclear about what I say or about what we discuss, you could ask questions. The concepts from the take-home test for this class will come from both the readings and the lectures. So there are concepts that you can define from the PowerPoint slides and from the lectures. And the final assignment will be a series of essay questions, and you are asked to write one essay. You can also construct your own essay assignment. You can construct your own topic for an essay with your own thesis. It should be about some aspect of the class, which is about Indigenous issues in Canada. I guess there is a bit of anxiety because it's the beginning still, and the assignments are still not clear. So I will post all of the assignment guidelines on Blackboard by this week. But the presentation is not due until March, and the final is not due until April. The take-home test will be next week. So you will still have the rest of the semester to finish all your work. There's nothing that's due right away. So decolonization is a term that you will probably hear throughout your university career and in your future career and in Canadian politics and globally. Decolonization is the process of ending colonialism, which is when an imperial nation takes control of a foreign territory. Decolonization can also refer to the process of challenging and identifying colonial systems, structures, and relationships. Decolonization in education. Decolonizing education involves rethinking the curriculum and research to include the perspective of people who are colonized or enslaved. It involves examining the biases and limitations of the current curriculum. It involves examining how colonialism has influenced education policies. It involves providing students and staff with the tools to identify and challenge the colonial hierarchies that are built into the education system. Decolonizing in other areas can also apply to housing, finance, healthcare, and policing. Decolonization can also apply to other areas of society. So decolonization is a process of ending colonialism, and it means a lot of different things to different people. So I also teach at the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto, and it's an art school, and I've taught several classes there over the years as a teaching assistant and then as a lecturer. And decolonization can also be a process of cultural celebration, recuperation, and also reconstruction. So in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, cultural genocide is seen to be as central as the theft of land and the killing of persons. Cultural genocide is really psychological. So trying to destroy a language, trying to destroy cultural symbols, trying to create a hierarchy, even in images and objects and symbols, is really a form of cultural genocide. So multicultural policy in the 1970s created a language of cultural pluralism and celebration. And what the report, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report documents, however, is a specific refusal to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous culture and language. And this is central to colonial discourse. So Decolonization can refer to actual claims to land and legal disputes regarding the mining of indigenous land. It can also refer to lawsuits like the class action lawsuit against the healthcare system throughout Canada by Indigenous women who have argued they were forcibly sterilized. It can also involve financial compensation for survivors of residential schools, and it can involve affirmative action. But decolonization can also involve questioning the relationship between cultural capital and colonialism. So the read this week is a reading by Pierre Bourdieu, and it's quite a short reading. Some of the readings on the syllabus are specifically about Indigenous issues and are written by Indigenous lawyers, activists, academics who are allies to Indigenous peoples. Some of the readings are very well cited pieces of theory. So writings written by Pierre Bourdieu and Giorgio Agamben are academic writings by European scholars that have been really well cited, which means that they're kind of popular within the liberal arts and humanities. So Pierre Bourdieu's writings regarding cultural capital are about class antagonism. And Bourdieu is interested in the ways that non-financial assets become a form of capital. So the way that we speak, our accents, how we use language, our clothing, the music that we listen to, the food that we eat, these can all be markers of class that are not actual capital. So Canada is a really interesting place to think about cultural capital. It is possible to be an immigrant, the child of immigrants, and to have a certain amount of capital in terms of money, property. But one might still not have the kind of cultural capital that would mean that they would be perceived of as being rich, supposedly. So even if you have a certain amount of financial capital, degrees, property, the way that you speak or eat or look or dress could still be perceived of as working class. And so Bourdieu is interested, however, in the ways that people who are middle class and rich over generations can mobilize this kind of cultural capital irrespective of hard work or education. So even if you do not get the best grades or you don't really make an effort, you could still perhaps use other forms of cultural capital to try to express class position. Pierre Bourdieu wrote this in the 1960s in France, and he was really writing about the 1960s in Europe. In our time period, the time of the internet, and also in a time when we're increasingly not really part of collectives, or we don't really participate in an enclosed society in public space. We don't necessarily interact with the same people every day, and we tend to work on the internet. This kind of cultural capital is not necessarily as important as it was in the past. However, the cultural capital that settlers possess against Indigenous peoples is perhaps central to ongoing processes of colonization. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls reports documents how the refusal to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous languages and cultures by the educational system historically, by the federal government, is part of colonization. and the efforts to celebrate Indigenous culture and to acknowledge the existence of indigeneity um, as a living set of cultural practices, um, ways of doing business, systems of knowledge is part of decolonization. So Dawn Raum is an Indigenous activist and model who states, "I am Native American from the Omaha tribe in Nebraska. My Indian name means shooting star. I wish the world knew that we do still exist. And no, we don't all live in teepees. When I see people in headdresses or Native accessories, I feel disrespected. They don't know the meaning behind it, how to wear it, or what we do to earn it. And this is a real eagle feather. It it doesn't just fall off an eagle and someone says, "Oh, here it's yours." You have to earn it in my culture. I feel powerful when I wear it, more confident and more connected to my ethnicity. I've never been embarrassed about being Native American. I take pride in it. I love how spiritual we are. It's like we're in tune with the earth and the universe. I know there's no other culture out there like mine. So, what Realm is making reference to, however, in this, um, the first paragraph, is when people try to appropriate indigenous signs and symbols. And sometimes they do this as a mockery, say on Halloween. There are other times where people just try to appropriate signs and symbols as a direct form of theft. So um, the clothing chain Urban Outfitters was sued by the Navajo Nation in the United States of America because Urban Outfitters appropriated signs and symbols from the Navajo Nation and tried to sell them on products. And so this kind of cultural theft, this kind of theft of intellectual property is common throughout the Americas. And cultural genocide then involves turning forms of cultural capital that indigenous people have over generations into signs and symbols that are mocked and degraded, but also stolen by colonizers, by colonizing powers. So Bourdieu is interested in the ways that intellectualism becomes a form of cultural capital. Sorry, let me look at the chat. No, I haven't seen the petition. Yeah, I will look at it. The politics of language are really important. Look at it now. Yeah, in 1994, it says the tribal council rejected a proposal to change the official name from Navajo to Dene, a traditional name for the people. So they're again considering changing the name. These debates are really interesting because there isn't a necessary, it sometimes involves a lot of debates between different generations of people or between different um, political views. So Toronto Metropolitan University is a university that I've worked for before, and it had the name Ryerson in the past, and there were lots of debates regarding the usefulness and need to change the name. And there are intelligent debates on both sides. Um, this is a really recent debate. It's interesting. If you're interested in thinking about these issues for your presentation or paper, it would make a really interesting essay or discussion because it is as recent as September 12th, 2024. Yes, they've said the term Dene, meaning the people in the Navajo language, is viewed by many as more culturally accurate reflection of the nation's heritage and identity. Yes, you can see it's really recent because in 1994 they decided that they weren't going to change the name, but the debate is back again. And it would be interesting to think about, to do research about what has happened from 1994 to now, what has happened, because there are different waves of activism. And the politics of naming also mean different things to people. It could also be about the US elections and US politics in the last years. Yeah. If you're interested in writing about this, I think it would make a really good issue because these debates about naming also have happened in Canada with the change of the name of Ryerson University to Toronto Metropolitan University. And it's again been in the last 10 years that this politics of decolonization has really affected language. I think it also corresponds to the time that we live in where people are advocating for themselves as people who have the right to be spoken about in ways that they choose to, specifically in regards to gender identity. There are a lot of debates regarding the use of gender pronouns and respect for others and accuracy in terms of language. Sorry, I'm sick. Cool. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I think my audio was not working. Apologize. So as I was saying, uh, is the sound working now? I apologize. Okay, good. Sorry. So Bourdieu was interested then in how colonization and European colonialism supported the construction of elite civilization as being superior to nature. So colonialism could be written of or could be thought of as a capitalist enterprise. So the construction of, say, high art or um, expensive clothing garments to buy, uh, food to eat, is all a way of selling culture. And the sale of culture, the construction of expensive elite objects that one must buy, is juxtaposed to nature. So Bourdieu was interested in the ways that constructing taste and civilization in opposition to nature is a way that class hierarchy is created. So Bourdieu writes, the denial of lower, coarse, vulgar, venal, servile, in a word, natural enjoyment, which constitutes the sacred sphere of culture, implies an affirmation of the superiority of those who can be satisfied with the sublimated, refined, disinterested, gratuitous, distinguished pleasures forever closed to the profane. This is why art and cultural consumption are predisposed, consciously and deliberately or not, to fulfill a social function of legitimating social differences. So this kind of legitimation of high art as being better than nature was central to colonialism. So this sculpture was created by Rebecca Belmore, and Rebecca Belmore was the first Indigenous woman to represent Canada at the Venice Biennale in Italy. And Rebecca Belmore is one of Canada's most celebrated artists. And in this sculpture, Stone Child, Rebecca Belmore used ice to spell the name of Neil Stonechild, who is discussed in one of our articles and I've talked about in a previous lecture and was killed by the Saskatoon police. So this is an example of contemporary Canadian art and the ways that contemporary Canadian art is involved in decolonization. So Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore produced this piece in 2019 called Freeze Stone Child Memorial to commemorate the tragedy of the freezing death of Neil Stonechild. It's a sculpture made entirely of ice and was installed outside the Remain Modern Gallery in Saskatoon. So the sculpture has been constructed many times. And it is one of Rebecca Belmore's very striking artistic works. So Rebecca Belmore is a Canadian interdisciplinary Anishinaabe artist who was notable for politically conscious and socially aware performance and installation work. She is Ojibwe and a member of Obishik-Okon Black Soul First Nation. Belmore currently lives in Toronto, Ontario. I hope that I pronounced this correctly. It is important, I think, for the purposes of language to try to pronounce words and terms correctly. This is also true when I will discuss India as well in my research about India, and I do have parents who are from India, so I am familiar with some of the terms, but still, in your presentations, hopefully you can try to pronounce terminology correctly, but it isn't against the law to obviously pronounce certain things with different accents. I do think the intention to show respect for linguistic diversity, I think, is obviously more important than practicing, I guess, to have a different accent. So Rebecca Belmore has performed and exhibited nationally and internationally since 1986. Her work focuses on issues of place and identity and confronts challenges for First Nations people. Her work addresses history, voice, and voicelessness, place, and identity. So Rebecca Belmore is a really interesting example of a Canadian artist whose work I think challenges cultural genocide, but also challenges the idea that there is kind of cultural authenticity. And what I find interesting about Rebecca Belmore is, from a feminist perspective, the idea of cultural authenticity often means that, like if we're, the example I will give is India and the Indian diaspora. Sometimes cultural authenticity often ignores contemporary queer and feminist uh, identity. So the kinds of cultural authenticity that are often celebrated can involve certain gendered norms or norms around a division of labor that involves women's cooking or reproductive labor as opposed to men's productive labor. So Rebecca Belmore's work, I think, is interesting because the artist specifically uses strong feminist themes to comment not only on colonization but on gender equality. Share my screen. For some reason, I can't share my screen, so I'll go back to the slides. Hopefully, I've contacted IT services about Black board. I mean, it's okay, but it's difficult to show any clips for some reason. Sorry, again, it's okay. Yeah, I will try again to meet with somebody in IT services regarding Collaborate because there have been a few problems. Hopefully, everything will be sorted out eventually after this first few weeks. So, staged on the terrain of the federal constitutional structure, identity politics have played a large part in the Canadian political conversation since Quebecois nationalism forced itself into the Canadian consciousness in the 1970s. So, national identity and this question of language, I think, is a really brilliant one. And your comments regarding the changing of names and language, I think, are really central to some of the most interesting debates in Canadian history and Canadian politics. Language and what constitutes our national language and our national identity and how we speak and what terms we use have been at the forefront of Canadian politics throughout the whole history of Canada. And there have also been obvious debates in the last few years about gender identity and gender pronouns. So, language is central to debates regarding indigeneity, but also other rights of other minorities in Canada or other uh, people who can claim to be historically oppressed in Canada. Um, the term minority is sometimes contentious, but people who can claim to be historically oppressed peoples often have claims to another language, another linguistic register, and another set of names. So the jurisdictional distribution of powers between the national and the provincial governments originates in the British North America Act in 1867. During the late 20th century, constitutional politics preoccupied Canadian political elites, culminating in the patriation of the British North America Act 1867, now renamed the Constitutional Act of 1867, and the inclusion of the Constitutional Act 1982 and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms 1982. Canada's Canada's federal structure meant that federal and provincial governments, or rather the first ministers thereof, had to negotiate the conditions for patriation and the new constitutional instruments by achieving a substantial consensus. The politicking of the first ministers was focused on French-English cleavages and on the dynamics of federalism. The emergence of citizen and movement politics, notably Aboriginal and women's organizations, prioritized a rights discourse discourse and a focus on citizens rather than on governments. So this focus on citizens rather than governments centers a rights-based approach. And it's interesting to think about the justification for advocating for social justice from a philosophical perspective. There are some who would argue that the scale and the size of any group of people who demands rights and demands linguistic integrity, or to be counted as those deserving of affirmative action. So there are those who would argue that one has to be part of a very large group of people in order to claim those rights. There are others that would argue that the numbers of oppressed people do not matter. What matters is the alleviation of suffering and redress for trauma. So even if a very small percentage of, say, people with disabilities live in a certain province, the fact that they don't form a huge cleavage or group or lobby group does not mean that they're not guaranteed human rights on the grounds of compassion. So Indigenous philosophies and understanding Indigenous philosophies are central then to decolonization. Just like the interesting debate that you offered, or example that you offered about names, philosophy is really about knowledge production and who can produce knowledge and what terms we use and who we associate with being an intellectual. Karl Marx was really interested in the ways that class antagonism is not just about work. It is not just about who is paid an extensive amount of money for doing certain kinds of labor and who is not. It is also about who is thought to be intelligent, who can produce ideas, who can produce knowledge, which names do we associate with intelligence. The feminist and queer and transgender rights movement has an ongoing discussion within the university and outside of the university regarding knowledge production. For several decades, it was predominantly only cisgender men's names who were associated with intelligence and knowledge production. And this has changed somewhat, but debates regarding who knows more than others, or who is in the know, and therefore who can produce authorial claims and produce knowledge that we all repeat, are central to decolonization. So Indigenous philosophies contain a prevailing notion of the relationship of human beings with other species beings, rather than the hierarchical model suggested, for example, by the Genesis myth that places man at the pinnacle of a creation that is made for his benefit and domination. In Indigenous cosmologies, the Creator is understood to be of and for all elements of creation. The theologies and other myths of Indigenous peoples reflect and reaffirm this primary relationship within territories and ecosystems. The structures of land-based societies also produce social pressures, favoring internal conflict, minimization, and the honoring of relationships. And the majority of Indigenous cultures reference space or place in matters of philosophy. When indigenous peoples from all around the world get together, for example, at international conferences, there is mutual recognition of these shared values which transcend cultural and historical differences and geographical spaces. Decolonization, then, is a process rather than a destination. It involves individual agency, collective self-determination, and political choices framed by history and by normative visions of contemporary cultural authenticity. So when I share the slides, I will put the exact reference uh, from this author's work, which was about authenticity and decolonization. And it is an Indigenous scholar in Canada, but I'll give you the direct reference when I share the slides and the recordings at the end of the week, which is Friday. So I'll finish by discussing neoliberalism. So in previous classes, we talked about the relationship between neoliberalism and violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So the social welfare state model would have once protected people from homelessness, housing scarcity, massive forms of student debt. And what the social welfare state model did in the 1960s and 70s was to protect people who were born or lived in a certain geographical location. And so if you paid taxes, then you were guaranteed certain things. The Canadian healthcare system is an example of a social welfare state model. However, many other services, including education, housing, food security, are all private forms of capital. So even if you were born in a certain place or you have claimed residency somewhere for years, you might not be guaranteed certain things. So neoliberalism is a new form of liberalism. Neo meaning new, liberalism meaning liberal, free. So it means new forms of freedom. So what this means is that you could go on the internet, and if you found a job in the United States of America, you could work online and make the US dollar. That is possible. You could also decide to move. You could go online and apply for a master's degree in London, England, and you could decide to move, you can get a visa, you can do all that online. So we're not bound or we're not held in place by localized economies anymore. The problem is that there are no guarantees. So if you were to do this, if many people were to do this, then what would happen to all of the local industries? If you're saving money to move to New York or to Berlin, what happens to the local economy? So Anna Hunter and Richard Falk uh, invoke the centrality of tradition to Aboriginal identity and rights claims, including the right to self-determination, which includes the more anemic self-government, and to particular political outcomes. Hunter argues that, quote, Aboriginal people generally approach politics informed by their traditional values, ceremonies, and the teachings of elders and other respected leaders, and Aboriginal people use a different set of benchmarks to measure policy success: the will to sustain Aboriginal languages, cultures, and traditions. Similarly, Falk writes, Indigenous peoples seeking to have the right to a separate existence based on their traditional patterns of organization and governance, insist that the traditionalist alternative be legitimized and to the extent necessarily safeguarded. These traditions are invoked in contradistinction to liberal market and consumer values. So again, liberalism involves this kind of new freedom to sell and to buy. But if we look at the examples of, say, patents and intellectual copyright, we don't have the freedom to steal and to sell and to buy freely. And the internet is a great example. If I was to find symbols on the internet, or if I was to find artistic work on the internet or songs on the internet, can I just use them and put my name on them? No, I cannot, because of intellectual property law and copyright law. However, is it possible for me to easily do this? Yes, because the internet means that I can cut and paste from anywhere. I can take other people's work. The context and the meaning behind these symbols then is lost. So these traditions are invoked in contradistinction to the liberal market and consumer values assumed to be universal by the apostles of neoliberalism and modernization. The framing of these values in the language of collective human rights and self-determination has produced what Falk calls the first truly intercivilizational critique of the prevailing human rights discourse and its world order implications. So free market capitalism, which involves the possibility of selling and buying one's labor, or selling and buying goods without any limit, has been challenged again and again by indigenous rights groups and by philosophers who question different forms of entitlement. So one's entitlement to sell and to buy anything and everything at all times can be called into question when we think about historical responsibilities to colonized peoples. So identity is central to decolonization, and authors who are interested in the language of decolonization and identity politics discuss the ways that authenticity is often debated, and who can and cannot speak, and who can and cannot claim authority in certain matters is something that is central to the politics of decolonization and to debates regarding knowledge production. Identity emerges from culture and historical context, and thus is linked to politics. Collective experiences are shaped and understood by culture and by the stories by which we remember our experiences and interpret our histories. Individuals understand themselves in relation to these collective experiences and imaginings, forming their sense of identity from these foundational psychosocial, political, and material realities. Nor is culture reducible to a list of attributes on some anthropological checklist. It involves processes that respond to change over time, while transmitting core myths and values that place individuals in meaningful context. So I'll finish by discussing the law. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a UN document. And it establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples of the world. So the power to determine identity or membership, writes the Declaration, should not be used in ways that violate fundamental human rights, including tautologically the right to culture and community, that is, the right to one's identity. Indigenous nations and communities are also bound by the international human rights standards that they have invoked in struggles against colonialism. And so Article 46 of this document called DRIP, which is an acronym for the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, DRIP, links the exercise of Indigenous rights to human rights and fundamental freedoms to democratic society. So decolonization is linked uneasily to liberalism through human rights discourse, and the crucible of contested discourse produces a new set of analytical tools, the emerging shape of post-liberal and post-colonial theories. The power of and over identity in community, and thus membership, and over the authoritative interpretation of culture, is a challenge for decolonizing communities. And so I think the challenge at the heart of these debates is really about capitalism. Decolonization as a language asks us to pay respect for linguistic diversity, for cultural traditions and religious practices that existed before colonial rule, and that require work in understanding and appreciating. However, capitalism often structures who can and cannot produce knowledge, whose work we know about and respect, and whose life ends up having protection on the street, in jobs, in housing, security. So this kind of rights-based language does not necessarily achieve economic justice. And so the question regarding, I guess the question that one would ask from a Marxist perspective is whether or not this kind of respect for linguistic and cultural diversity, this fixation on the sanctity of names and identity-based groups changes the class structure and guarantees any kind of economic justice to colonized peoples. Discrimination is central to this UN declaration, and challenging discrimination against Indigenous peoples is central to the politics of decolonization. So more than just being about language and the celebration of cultural diversity or symbols or signs, addressing the reality of everyday racism is also central to decolonization. And addressing everyday discrimination or challenging it is also a way of trying to address imbalances in the class structure. So statistics show that discrimination is quite common against Indigenous people. And what statistics show at the federal level is that discrimination in all areas of life, including everyday public harassment, name calling, bullying in schools, housing insecurity, and discrimination in hiring and in the workplace, is more common among Black and Indigenous peoples in Canada than other people. So discrimination was more common among the Indigenous population than among populations who are both non-Indigenous and non-visible minority. More specifically, 44% of First Nations people had experienced discrimination in the 5 years preceding the survey, as had 24% of the Métis and 29% of Inuit. Among those who were discriminated against, 21% of Indigenous people and 16% of Black people said it was when dealing with police, compared with 4% of non-Indigenous, non-visible minority people who experienced discrimination. So I'll stop the lecture there, and next time when we meet, I will discuss police in more detail, because I think the issue of police and policing and police powers is central to our time and to social movements in this time. And so the next class I will talk about police in more detail. I will also post the 30th for this class. For the 1261 class I teach, the test will be posted on 23rd. For this class, you have another week. Are there any questions? Thank you very much for your comments. I think the discussion regarding naming is really fascinating. And if you're interested in giving a presentation about this or writing an essay about this, I think it would make a great topic, specifically in regards to Canada's history of language politics. And in relation to the recent debates regarding gender pronouns and names in Canada. Is questions about the language we use and who we have to show respect to, and who we essentially have to do work for, is, I think, central to contemporary Canada and the history of Canadian politics. So that is the class for this week. Thank you very much for your participation. And I will send you the PowerPoints and the recorded lectures on Friday, if in case you missed the discussion or you would like to listen to the recordings. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks. I'll end the session now because I teach another class right after this, and I know some of you are in both classes.